My name is Michael, and for most of my life, that seemed like enough. I grew up in a family that valued predictability above all else. We were reliable people in small, quiet ways, the kind of people whose absence would barely register except as a missing presence, not a drama. Being a good was the currency I understood: good son, good student, good friend. Michael was a name that fit neatly into that pattern. It carried weight, but only the kind that was expected. It didn't demand attention. It didn't invite questions. And I liked it that way. On the surface, I fit. People trusted me because I presented myself clearly. I didn't have to prove anything, I simply performed the ordinary. I mistook that for self-knowledge, a belief that who I was inside had been fully accounted for because I had learned to be legible. But bodies and minds notice things that others overlook. I began noticing small details about people, the way they carried themselves, the subtle decisions they made in how to occupy space, the quiet power of inhabiting a self fully. At first, these observations seemed innocent, abstract, aesthetic. Yet they left a residue, a soft awareness of longing I didn't understand. It wasn't desire. It wasn't envy. It was something harder to name: recognition. Recognition became curiosity. Curiosity became private experiments. They were quiet, careful, almost clinical. Alone in my apartment, I explored the sensations of expression and form that felt close to me in everyday life. Not because I wanted attention or drama, but because I needed to know what it felt like to exist differently, even temporarily. I was careful. Careful not because I felt guilt, but because I had learned early that being misunderstood is painless only until it isn't. Secrecy wasn't shame, it was precaution. I was protecting myself from interpretation, not judgment. And then there was her. We had known each other long enough for pretense to have worn thin, but not long enough to have exhausted curiosity. She was perceptive, the kind of person who notices without prying, who listens without immediately solving. I trusted her, though I couldn't articulate why beyond the simple fact that she paid attention without trying to edit me. That day, the ordinary collided with the private. I didn't plan for her to arrive, didn't anticipate that the boundary I maintained so meticulously would be breached by circumstance. And yet, when she entered, she saw me. Not in the exaggerated way movies promise, not with shock or derision, but fully. And I felt the weight of every hidden layer of myself, all the private experiments and small truths I had compartmentalized, settle into the room between us. I expected her to react. I expected a question, a judgment, even a joke. But she did none of these. She simply noticed. She acknowledged my presence and my difference without forcing an immediate definition. "Are you okay?" she asked. Simple words, but they carried patience, and more than that, permission. Permission to exist in that moment without having to explain, justify, or perform. I said, "I don't know," because that was the only true answer. Saying it aloud made it tangible. It wasn't dramatic or clever, it was honest. And honesty, in that quiet room, was transformative. I realized then how much of my life had been spent avoiding questions I didn't know how to answer. I wasn't hiding from the world, I was hiding from myself. The self I had been protecting, Michael, the reliable, the predictable, was no longer sufficient. There was more, and I had to acknowledge it, slowly, carefully, ethically. The lesson wasn't about what I wore, or how I looked, or even the curiosity that had brought me here. It was about visibility, responsibility, and integrity. To be seen is not merely to be observed, it is to reckon with the consequences of that observation and to honor it with honesty and respect. That day, nothing external changed. The apartment was still small, still orderly. She left, as she always did, with quiet grace. And yet, inside, everything shifted. I understood, in a way I never had before, that transformation begins not with the eye but with the conscience. Not with spectacle, but with acknowledgement. I was still Michael, but for the first time, I knew Michael was more than the name, the label, the expectation. He was a work in progress, an ethical project, a person navigating uncertainty with honesty. That was the beginning. The days that followed that encounter with Elise were quieter than I expected, yet louder in ways I hadn't anticipated. The apartment felt different. Not materially different, nothing had changed except the way I moved through it, the way I felt the air settle on my skin, the way silence pressed itself against my thoughts. Ordinary routines, once comforting, now carried a strange weight. I noticed the faint scuff of my shoes against the hardwood floor, the dull hum of the refrigerator, the way light hit the corners of the room at different angles. These small things, insignificant before, became anchors, reminders that I existed in more than one dimension, that the self I had always considered sufficient was only part of the story. I began to think about my past differently. The pattern of my life had always been repetition: school, work, social interactions, sleep, the rare indulgence of something spontaneous. Everything carefully measured, everything easily categorized. And yet, in all those years, I realized I had been living in partial view, as though the person I allowed to exist was merely a projection designed to be readable to others. The private Michael, the one who lingered in curiosity, who felt the pull of unspoken recognition, had been quietly waiting, biding his time, growing impatient with the version of myself I presented to the world. I became more aware of how much energy I had spent maintaining appearances. Small decisions that once felt inconsequential, how I dressed for work, the tone of my voice, the timing of my gestures, were all extensions of an invisible armor I had built to avoid misunderstanding. I hadn't realized how exhausting it was to maintain that facade until it began to slip in subtle ways. The curiosity that had always existed quietly in the background started to seep into moments I thought were safe. I would catch myself observing people in ways that felt slightly off limits, noting how someone moved, the rhythm of their hands, the tilt of their head, the flow of their energy. And with each observation came a quiet question: why can't I inhabit that? I tried to answer that question logically at first. Safety, I told myself. Norms. Expectation. Discretion. The reasons made sense externally, but internally they felt hollow. The more I avoided the question, the more persistent it became, threading itself into everyday life. Curiosity transformed into reflection, reflection into ethical consideration. It wasn't a desire for spectacle or attention. It was a recognition that I had been living incompletely and that incompleteness carried consequences. Elise became, unintentionally, a kind of mirror. Not in the way people talk about mirrors as reflections, but as a presence that allowed me to observe myself without distortion. Her patience was remarkable. She never pressed, never prodded, never asked for explanations she didn't truly need. In a way, she taught me how to inhabit my own complexity responsibly. Being seen by someone without judgment forced me to confront the ethical dimension of my curiosity. How could I explore myself fully while remaining accountable to those around me? I started keeping longer, more deliberate journals, not to document transformation in a performative way, but to capture the subtle shifts of my perception. I wrote about thoughts I had never dared to articulate aloud, about moments of recognition that were too fragile for conversation. Writing became a bridge between the private and the interpersonal, a space where I could weigh consequences, examine motives, and practice integrity with myself before negotiating it with the world. I also noticed how much I had internalized social expectation. It wasn't just family or friends, it was the culture of subtle norms, of legibility, of comfort. Every time I strayed even slightly from the expected, I felt the tug of hypothetical judgment, the imagined whispers of neighbors, colleagues, strangers. It wasn't fear in the dramatic sense, but an almost gravitational pull toward conformity. I realized that what I had been resisting wasn't external scrutiny alone, it was internalized scrutiny, the silent shaping of self by imagined others. At the same time, I became aware of empathy in a new dimension. Not empathy as sympathy or admiration, but as recognition of the layered existence of others. Observing someone who carried themselves fully, who expressed themselves without hesitation, sparked a quiet moral reflection in me. How many of us live in partial view, constrained by expectation, hiding fragments of self not because of shame, but because of fear of being misread? And if that is true, what is my responsibility, not only to myself, but to others who inhabit a similar invisibility? These reflections weren't abstract. They intersected with my daily life constantly. I started noticing subtle judgments I had absorbed unconsciously, comments about appearance, about gender, about propriety, that shaped how I interacted with friends, colleagues, even strangers. I noticed moments when I unconsciously edited myself to conform, and each time, I felt a pang of regret for my own compliance. The awareness was uncomfortable, yet liberating. Recognition had shifted from passive observation to active moral engagement, noticing, reflecting, and choosing consciously how to act. I experimented in small, deliberate ways. Not outwardly or publicly, not yet, but in ways that allowed me to inhabit dimensions of myself I had long denied. I tried new combinations of clothing in private, observed how my posture changed when I moved differently, experimented with speech patterns that felt closer to my internal rhythms. Each step was both technical and ethical. I asked myself constantly, what am I seeking here? Why am I doing this? What is my responsibility to myself and to the others who may witness me? Curiosity alone was no longer sufficient. I needed reflection, accountability, patience. Every small act carried a dual weight, the internal truth of my experience and the ethical resonance of visibility. I realized that transformation is not a spectacle. It is a negotiation between desire and restraint, between self-exploration and moral responsibility, between curiosity and empathy. Each decision reshaped not only my internal narrative but the ethical framework I carried into the world. And then came moments of tension that surprised me. Social interactions that had always been predictable suddenly felt fraught with nuance. Casual conversations, once routine, became tests of integrity, how much to reveal, how much to protect, how to remain honest without overexposing myself. Every encounter required reflection. I became conscious of micro-expressions, of the tone of voice, of the subtle assumptions embedded in words. Nothing felt performative. Everything required deliberate attention, ethical and emotional awareness. Through all of this, I began to understand the nature of internal conflict differently. It isn't loud, dramatic, or obvious. It creeps in slowly, threading itself through daily life. It appears in moments of hesitation, in glances at the mirror, in the discomfort of not being fully known or fully understood. I learned that conflict is not inherently destructive. It is informative, signaling where integrity, empathy, and self-awareness are required. I started to see patterns in myself that I had previously dismissed. The urge to hide, the instinct to perform, the quiet fascination with forms of expression that were unfamiliar, all of it made sense as part of a continuum of identity. None of it needed to be sensationalized. None of it required an audience. It was simply part of the ethical, psychological, and emotional work of inhabiting a self honestly. At night, when the apartment was silent and the city outside blurred into distant lights, I often sat with a cup of tea, staring at nothing, thinking about identity as responsibility. I realized that being seen, and seeing oneself, is inseparable from accountability. To explore oneself fully is not merely to indulge curiosity, but to navigate it with consciousness, reflection, and care. Each decision reverberates outward, even in ways we cannot anticipate. And I realized, with a clarity that left me both humbled and alert, that living fully requires moral engagement, with yourself, with others, and with the world's expectations. This understanding didn't come with revelation or sudden clarity. It arrived gradually, in quiet, cumulative moments, each one pressing lightly but insistently against my assumptions. Michael, the version of myself I had trusted as complete, was no longer sufficient. He had to evolve ethically before he could evolve in any other dimension. Transformation is not just about change, it is about responsibility, awareness, and moral courage. And it is, above all, a slow and deliberate process, built one reflective, ethical moment at a time. It started quietly, as most significant shifts do, in the spaces I thought I understood best, the living room of a friend's apartment, the familiar hum of conversation, the soft clatter of coffee cups. Friends had always been a kind of safety net for me, not in a dramatic or possessive way, but as confirmation that the person I presented was coherent, readable, consistent. That Michael was, at least socially, complete. And for a long time, that had been enough. But now, nothing was enough. Even among people I trusted, I felt a tremor of dissonance. Sitting across from Jamie, my oldest friend, I noticed the small gestures I had once ignored, the way her eyebrows rose in subtle surprise, the tilt of her head as she listened, the hesitation before she spoke. I realized I had always done this, observing people with a clinical attentiveness, cataloging expression and nuance, but now, the observation had a different purpose. I wasn't merely noticing others. I was noticing myself. I was noticing what I wanted, what I feared, what I had hidden from everyone, including myself. It was terrifying in the most ordinary way. One evening, Jamie invited me over after work. We settled onto the couch with mugs of tea, and the conversation flowed around the usual topics: work, mutual friends, minor inconveniences. But I found myself drifting inward, noticing the rhythm of her voice and the way our conversation moved in patterns I had once taken for granted. I noticed my posture, my breathing, the subtle choices I made in expression, and how each of those choices kept me legible, coherent, expected. And I realized, with a small pang, that the Michael I had been performing was not fully present. I wanted to be fully present. I didn't speak immediately. Instead, I allowed myself the luxury of reflection, of watching myself in real time, of understanding how much effort I had put into blending, into avoiding discomfort, into maintaining predictability. It wasn't shame that I felt, it was recognition. A quiet, almost solemn acknowledgement that I had been living in partial view, and that partiality had consequences for my relationships, for my sense of self, and for the way I navigated the world. Eventually, the words came, haltingly, because honesty is never neat. "Jamie," I said, "I've been thinking a lot about who I am, who I've been, and what I hide from even myself." She didn't react with judgment or curiosity. She simply nodded, as though she had been expecting this, or at least willing to receive it without demand. It was remarkable in its subtlety. The patience, the space, it felt revolutionary to me. "Go on," she said softly. And that simple invitation, that lack of pressure, allowed me to articulate thoughts I had never dared put into language. I spoke about awareness and recognition, about the curiosity that had followed me for years, about private explorations that were less about spectacle and more about understanding myself. I spoke about fear, the fear of being misread, of being reduced, of being interpreted through frameworks I hadn't chosen. And I spoke about responsibility, about the ethical dimension of being seen and seeing oneself, about the delicate negotiation between internal truth and social expectation. Jamie listened. Not passively, not superficially, but with attention that felt intentional. I noticed her gestures, the slight lean forward, the brief moments when her eyes softened, the quiet pauses that allowed space for thought. I realized that understanding doesn't always arrive in answers, sometimes it comes in the willingness to witness, to remain present without needing to shape or correct. That evening became a turning point. Not because any external event occurred, not because I made a dramatic confession or changed my life overnight, but because the encounter made me confront a new layer of ethical and emotional responsibility. I realized that living partially, even privately, had consequences. The relationships I valued were not just shaped by my presence, but by my absence, by the facets of myself I had chosen to hide. Over the following weeks, I became acutely aware of subtle social tensions I had previously ignored. Casual conversations now carried layered meaning. Observations of gestures, expressions, and tone became ethical exercises. When I said nothing, when I performed coherence, what was I protecting? Myself? Others? Expectations I had absorbed unconsciously? And when I allowed hints of vulnerability, what responsibility did I have for how those hints would be received? I experimented carefully. Not in public, not in ways that demanded attention, but in ways that allowed me to inhabit more dimensions of myself privately, while remaining mindful of ethical impact. I paid attention to how my posture shifted, how my voice sounded, how my expressions aligned with inner truth. Each small choice was both practical and moral. Each experiment was a negotiation, a test of integrity. And I realized something crucial: transformation is less about spectacle than it is about attention. Attention to self, attention to others, attention to the ethical resonance of visibility. Every glance, every gesture, every word carried dual weight, the internal reality of my experience and the external consequences of being partially revealed. I began to understand that identity is not simply a matter of self-perception. It is a lived negotiation, continuously calibrated against the impact it has on the world. I also began to notice empathy in new ways. Observing the subtle cues of others, friends, strangers, colleagues, I recognized the pressure they too felt to remain legible, coherent, acceptable. I began to wonder, how many people inhabit partial versions of themselves to avoid misunderstanding, misinterpretation, or disapproval? And if that is true, what is my responsibility to those people? How can I navigate my own journey ethically while recognizing the invisible compromises others make every day? Evenings became exercises in quiet reflection. I walked through neighborhoods, paying attention to rhythms of movement, to the ways people held themselves, to the subtle ethical negotiations written across posture and expression. I realized that visibility is never neutral. Every choice, every movement, every self-representation interacts with others' assumptions, perceptions, and expectations. And I understood, for the first time, the true weight of responsibility that comes with inhabiting a self fully. There were moments of tension that surprised me. Minor social missteps, pauses too long, gestures too deliberate, expressions that revealed more than I intended, suddenly felt significant. I began to notice the ethical stakes in small interactions, in ways I had never been attuned to before. And I realized that transformation, even at its most private, is inseparable from moral reflection. To inhabit oneself ethically is to recognize the potential impact of every action, internal or external, intended or accidental. In parallel, I became increasingly aware of the internalized norms I had absorbed unconsciously. Assumptions about propriety, expectation, gender, and legibility shaped my behavior more than I had realized. Each moment of self-observation revealed patterns I had not interrogated. And with awareness came choice. I began to practice deliberate, ethical decision-making in the way I expressed myself, even in small, private ways, because I recognized that these choices were not trivial. They were the groundwork for the self I was learning to inhabit. Slowly, quietly, I began to inhabit more of myself. Not spectacularly. Not dramatically. Not in ways that demanded observation. But in ways that were deliberate, reflective, accountable. The process was uneven, sometimes halting, sometimes startling. I made mistakes. I misjudged social cues. I revealed more than intended. But each misstep became an opportunity for reflection, an exercise in ethical growth, an experiment in navigating visibility responsibly. And through it all, I noticed the first threads of internal coherence emerging. The private Michael, the one who had always existed in partial view, began to integrate with the social Michael. Not fully. Not neatly. But enough to sense the contours of an ethical, reflective, and emotionally honest self. A self capable of inhabiting curiosity, complexity, and responsibility simultaneously. Transformation, I realized, is not instantaneous. It is incremental, cumulative, and painstaking. It is lived, experienced, reflected upon, and recalibrated continuously. It is ethical as much as emotional, moral as much as aesthetic. And it requires courage, not the kind celebrated in dramatic stories, but the quiet, sustained courage of inhabiting a self honestly, ethically, and attentively, every single day. The first time I considered stepping beyond my private boundaries, I felt a quiet, almost trembling hesitation. I wasn't thinking about dramatic entrances or public performance. I was thinking about ordinary spaces, the coffee shop around the corner, the library where I studied, the streets I walked every evening. Spaces that had always felt neutral now carried subtle, layered meaning. How could I occupy them differently without collapsing under the weight of expectation? How could I inhabit more of myself without causing harm to others, or to the fragile trust one had in my own judgment? It began with clothing. Not for attention, not for spectacle, but for alignment with internal truth. I experimented first in my apartment, as I always had, but this time the intention was different. The goal was not curiosity alone. It was ethical integrity, a deliberate step toward inhabiting the self I had been nurturing privately. Each choice, fabric, color, fit, was measured. I asked myself constantly, why this? What am I trying to express? What responsibility do I carry in revealing even this much? The first time I stepped outside in a way that slightly challenged expectation, the world felt heavier. Not threatening, but alert. I felt each gaze, real or imagined, as a subtle negotiation. Every glance became a question, every pause a mirror. I realized how deeply perception shapes experience, and how fragile the balance is between internal truth and external interpretation. At first, I chose low-risk spaces. Familiar streets, times when few would notice. And yet, even these small acts carried intensity. Each step forward was both a physical movement and an ethical experiment. I noticed the effect on myself immediately, posture shifted, breathing changed, awareness sharpened. I had expected relief or exhilaration. Instead, I felt something more nuanced, responsibility. A sense that inhabiting myself fully demanded careful, deliberate attention. I began to notice how much I had internalized the gaze of others. It wasn't conscious surveillance. It was the quiet imprint of norms, the constant calibration of behavior to avoid misunderstanding or disapproval. And now, even when I was alone, those norms pressed against me. Every step, every gesture, every glance in a public space became a negotiation. What am I showing? What am I hiding? What impact might this have, even if no one articulates it? I kept journals, long entries filled with reflection, analysis, and moral reckoning. Not to document for others, but to create a space where I could test decisions ethically before acting in the world. Writing became a kind of rehearsal, a meditation on intention, consequence, and awareness. I explored every subtle reaction, the pride that came with alignment, the fear that came with exposure, the empathy that emerged as I considered the potential perception of strangers, friends, and even casual acquaintances. Friends were the next frontier. Not in confessional bursts, but in small, deliberate gestures of revelation. I experimented with subtle shifts in presentation around Jamie, around Elise, around other friends whose perceptiveness I trusted. Each small act, a softer tone, a particular gesture, a choice of clothing slightly divergent from expectation, was an ethical decision. I constantly asked myself, am I being honest? Am I being responsible? Am I accounting for the other person's space and experience as well as my own? Some reactions were neutral. Some were subtle, curious, questioning. And some, inevitably, required dialogue, explanation, reflection. I learned, in a slow, cumulative way, that accountability is not a one-time act. It is sustained, iterative, relational. Each choice, each expression, each interaction carries forward into the ethical landscape we inhabit with others. I could no longer afford to act purely on internal truth without considering relational context. Walking through public spaces became a practice in mindfulness, ethical awareness, and empathy. I noticed how others move, how their bodies communicate, how social norms shape interaction even in ways no one consciously observes. I recognized patterns of avoidance, subtle compliance, and quiet self-editing in myself that mirrored the behavior of others. It was humbling to realize how pervasive these dynamics are, and how much courage it requires to inhabit a self authentically in public. And yet, there was joy too. Not the flashy, performative joy of attention, but the quiet, resonant joy of alignment. Each step outside, each carefully chosen expression, carried a sense of self-coherence I had rarely experienced. I felt grounded in ways that did not depend on external validation. The alignment of inner awareness, ethical reflection, and outward presence was deeply satisfying, even when fraught with tension. I began to understand the interplay of visibility and moral responsibility more acutely. To exist partially revealed is to carry dual burdens, the burden of self-truth and the burden of relational consequence. To exist fully is not reckless exposure, but careful negotiation, an ongoing calibration of internal alignment and ethical awareness. Every glance, every pause, every subtle movement is part of that negotiation. Each interaction, even mundane ones, requires mindfulness, honesty, and empathy. There were moments of dissonance. Strangers would glance, sometimes longer than expected, and I would feel the sudden surge of apprehension. Was I being misread? Was I imposing? Was my presence disruptive? I realized quickly that discomfort, both mine and theirs, was not a moral failing, but a signal. A signal that social perception and personal truth intersect in unpredictable ways. And it was my responsibility to navigate that intersection with awareness, patience, and integrity. I also began to notice a shift in my own perception of time and space. Ordinary walks became exercises in observation, awareness, and reflection. I noted the rhythm of movement around me, the pauses in conversation, the subtle communication of bodies. And I reflected on my own movements, how they aligned with intention, how they expressed truth, how they resonated ethically with others. In these small exercises, I learned to inhabit both self and space with conscious care. With friends, I experimented more openly. Not revelations or confessions, but subtle cues that hinted at the inner work I was doing. A gesture here, a tone there, a shift in posture. Each was a deliberate act, a test of relational awareness. Some noticed, some did not. Some reacted with curiosity, others with silence. And each reaction, whatever it was, became material for reflection. I learned how to inhabit myself responsibly, aware that perception is never neutral, that ethical engagement is continuous, and that the practice of visibility is a moral as well as an emotional endeavor. By the end of those months, I realized that transformation was no longer hypothetical. It was lived, iterative, relational, ethical, and deeply internal. The private Michael and the socially readable Michael were beginning to integrate, not fully, not neatly, but enough to inhabit life with more awareness, more accountability, more alignment. The next steps would be more public, more deliberate, more challenging. And I knew, with an almost serene certainty, that each step would demand the same vigilance, attention, ethical consideration, empathy, and courage. Transformation, I realized, is less about external markers and more about the quiet, sustained practice of inhabiting a self with integrity, accountability, and reflection. The first time I truly felt the weight of social perception, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, subtle, almost imperceptible, like a shift in the air you only notice when it no longer moves freely. I was at a small gathering, a casual dinner at Elise's apartment, surrounded by friends whose presence I trusted. I had chosen my outfit carefully, modestly divergent from my usual wardrobe, a soft blouse, unassuming but different enough that I felt it aligning more closely with the internal self I had been nurturing. I arrived early, as I often do when I need time to adjust my own awareness before the social demands begin. I moved through familiar spaces, but my own body felt foreign, a subtle tension running through muscles and posture I had rarely tested in public. I reminded myself repeatedly, this is not about spectacle. This is about integrity. This is about inhabiting yourself responsibly. Others arrived gradually, the room filling with warmth, conversation, and the low hum of ordinary life. I noticed glances, brief and neutral at first, then slightly longer, the kind that might indicate curiosity, recognition, or subtle confusion. I reminded myself not to interpret too quickly, not to assume meaning. I had learned that perception is a mirror, sometimes truthful, sometimes refracted through another's experience, assumptions, and bias. The tension began to build internally, not externally. I was acutely aware of every movement, every gesture, every subtle signal I emitted. My chest tightened in ways I didn't expect, my hands sought minor adjustments to clothing or posture as though these small corrections could stabilize perception. And through it all, I observed myself with a mixture of detachment and compassion. This is who you are. Not fully revealed, not fully understood, but fully present. And presence carries responsibility. At some point, Elise noticed my posture, the slight hesitance in my movements, and she leaned toward me with the same quiet attention she had always shown. No question, no judgment, just a presence that reminded me it was possible to inhabit complexity without fear. I realized then how rare this was, to be simultaneously vulnerable and supported, to test boundaries ethically without immediate consequence, to explore without spectacle. Still, the social dynamic was a delicate balancing act. Friends engaged me as always, asking questions, telling stories, laughing at small shared histories. I participated fully, but I carried an additional layer of awareness, the subtle ethical negotiation of self-expression. Each word, each glance, each smile required reflection. Am I revealing too much? Am I maintaining coherence for the group while inhabiting the fuller truth of myself? What impact might my presence have on those who notice more than I intend? Later, after the gathering, I reflected deeply on the experience. Visibility, even partial, is a continuous ethical exercise. It is not merely about comfort or courage, it is about awareness, responsibility, and empathy. To be seen is to navigate dual realities, your internal truth and the perceptions of those around you. And to do so ethically requires constant attention, reflection, and humility. In the weeks that followed, I began to encounter small, external challenges that tested this framework. Subtle commentary from acquaintances, offhand remarks about presentation or behavior, the occasional double-take from strangers, all became points of reflection. I did not react impulsively. I asked myself, what is my responsibility here? How do I respond without compromising integrity, honesty, or empathy? And slowly, through trial and reflection, I learned to inhabit tension with grace rather than avoidance. One afternoon, I found myself in a conversation with a coworker, Sam, who had noticed something slightly different about my appearance. His question was innocent, curious, but it carried weight. I paused, feeling the familiar tremor of uncertainty. The ethical reflection was immediate. I could deflect, ignore, or speak partially. Each option carried consequences. I chose partial honesty, careful not to perform, not to sensationalize, not to reduce myself or him. I explained simply that I had been exploring aspects of self-expression privately, that it was part of a personal journey, and that it did not impact my professional life. His reaction was what I had hoped for, attentive, non-judgmental, and curious, without insistence. And yet, even with this positive outcome, I reflected on the ethical responsibility embedded in the interaction. I had not merely revealed a facet of myself. I had also created a relational shift, however small, and with it came moral accountability. Each interaction of visibility, whether minor or major, carries weight that cannot be ignored. These experiences intensified my internal reflection. I began mapping, consciously and repeatedly, the spaces I inhabited, public, social, private. I noted how internal tension, ethical consideration, and social dynamics intertwined. I realized that transformation is not linear. It is not simply private exploration followed by external revelation. It is an ongoing negotiation of identity, responsibility, and empathy, a continuous calibration of self against the world. Family became the next frontier, though indirectly. Conversations with my parents remained within familiar bounds, but I became acutely aware of the unspoken expectations they carried. My father's pauses, my mother's subtle adjustments in tone or posture, the quiet weight of their assumptions, all these became data points in a living system of relational ethics. I realized that even in spaces where I was not actively revealing change, my internal alignment influenced perception, subtly, imperceptibly. To inhabit myself ethically required careful attention, even in absence of direct observation. Friends, family, colleagues, each interaction became an exercise in conscious integrity. I discovered that vulnerability, even when measured, is a form of moral courage. It is an acknowledgement that self-expression does not exist in isolation, and that honesty, empathy, and patience are as necessary as alignment with internal truth. And I learned, in small, cumulative steps, that inhabiting oneself fully requires negotiation, with history, with perception, and with relational trust. I began to see patterns in myself more clearly, the instinct to hide, the reflexive editing, the subtle attempts to remain legible at the expense of internal truth. Each pattern revealed an opportunity for growth, a chance to recalibrate with mindfulness. I practiced deliberate acts of ethical self-expression, first in private, then in relationally safe spaces, then gradually in spaces of moderate uncertainty. And with each iteration, I felt a deepening coherence, a quiet integration of curiosity, responsibility, and awareness. Through all of this, the emotional stakes became tangible. Vulnerability carries weight precisely because it exposes truth without control over reception. I felt pride, relief, anxiety, and empathy simultaneously. I noticed how much courage it required to navigate ordinary life with the added dimension of ethical and relational consciousness. And I understood, viscerally, that this was not a phase, a curiosity, or a performance. It was the ongoing work of inhabiting oneself honestly, ethically, and attentively. By the end of this period, I recognized that the trajectory of transformation is deeply relational. It is not simply internal reflection or private experimentation. It is the interplay between self and others, the ethical calibration of visibility, and the continuous negotiation of identity in a world that rarely pauses for complexity. I realized, with a calm determination, that each step I had taken, each quiet experiment, each mindful conversation, each subtle act of ethical expression, was a deliberate act of moral and emotional integrity. And I knew, finally, that the next steps would demand even more attention, courage, and patience. Public perception, relational dynamics, and internal truth would converge more sharply. I could not control every interpretation, but I could inhabit the negotiation consciously, responsibly, ethically. Transformation, I understood now, is as much about accountability and empathy as it is about self-expression or alignment. It is an iterative, continuous process, stretching across private and public, internal and relational, expectation and authenticity. By the time I reached the stage I now recognize as pivotal, months had passed since the first quiet experiments, the first subtle shifts in posture, voice, and gesture. I had learned to inhabit myself with care, curiosity, and ethical awareness, but the transition from private alignment to broader integration demanded a deeper reckoning. It began with an ordinary afternoon in the park. Sunlight filtered through skeletal branches, soft and forgiving. Families walked past, couples lingered on benches, and joggers traced arcs across the grass. I noticed the rhythm of the world, the subtleties of movement, the tiny negotiations everyone performs unconsciously. And I noticed myself, Michael, inhabiting a body and mind that were slowly learning to align with a fuller truth. Not perfectly. Not definitively. But deliberately, ethically, intentionally. I had come to realize that inhabiting myself fully would inevitably intersect with perception, expectation, and social norms. This was no longer hypothetical. Every step, every gesture, every glance carried layered consequences. I was both observer and participant, analyst and actor, vulnerable and accountable. It was exhausting at times, yet profoundly clarifying. I sat on a bench and let my attention drift inward. I considered every relationship I had navigated in these months, the trust of friends, the patient attention of Elise, the quiet observation of Jamie, the subtle responses of colleagues and family. I reflected on the ethical weight each interaction carried. To reveal partially is to navigate consequence, to remain hidden is to deny relational truth. And I understood, clearly, that living ethically requires balancing these tensions continuously, patiently, and thoughtfully. I recalled the first moment Elise had seen me, quietly, without judgment, and how it had shifted the trajectory of my awareness. It had been the spark, yes, but it had not been a gift of absolution. It had been a call to responsibility, to inhabit self and space with integrity, to navigate visibility and perception with deliberate care, to cultivate empathy alongside curiosity. That memory became a guiding principle in every subsequent act of self-expression. Soon after, I encountered a moment that crystallized the stakes of full integration. A coworker, someone whose observation I had underestimated, commented subtly on a detail of my presentation, an inconspicuous blouse, a slight softness in my tone. It was not a critique, not even curiosity in its raw form. It was recognition. And recognition carries responsibility. I paused, considered carefully what I could reveal ethically, and responded with honesty tempered by relational awareness. I explained, succinctly, that I had been exploring aspects of expression privately, that it was part of a broader process of self-understanding, and that it did not affect professional obligations. His response was measured, attentive, non-judgmental, but the encounter left a lasting impression. I realized, fully, that each act of visibility, no matter how minor, alters relational dynamics. It shifts perception, expectations, and trust. It cannot be undertaken lightly. Transformation, I now understood with clarity, is inseparable from accountability. Identity is never a solitary act, it is inherently relational, ethical, and socially mediated. I began to extend this awareness to family. Conversations became exercises in nuance, patience, and honesty. I considered their assumptions, their unspoken expectations, and their histories with me. I recognized that visibility would create ripple effects, questions, adjustments, potential misunderstandings, but avoidance was no longer acceptable. I had learned, through months of careful experimentation and reflection, that inhabiting self partially, privately, forever, would leave me incomplete and defer relational truth. In these conversations, I discovered something profound: empathy is not abstract. It is lived. It is the continuous effort to inhabit another's perception while remaining ethically aligned with oneself. To explain without overexposing, to listen without judgment, to balance curiosity with care, this is empathy in practice. And I realized that identity, integrity, and ethical responsibility converge in these small, sustained acts. The process was neither fast nor easy. There were moments of doubt, misjudgments, and social tension. There were evenings when I questioned whether alignment was worth the exhaustion, whether visibility demanded more than I could ethically manage. But reflection tempered anxiety, patience dissolved impulsive fear, and ethical consideration provided clarity. Transformation, I understood, is iterative, lived, reflected upon, recalibrated, and sustained. By the time I reached a broader sense of integration, I noticed something subtle yet profound. My internal self, the curious, exploratory Michael, had begun to coexist coherently with the socially legible Michael. Not fully merged, not neatly aligned, but sufficiently integrated to inhabit the world with honesty, empathy, and responsibility. Each interaction, each minor revelation, each deliberate choice of expression became a practice of ethical alignment. I came to understand that the ultimate challenge of transformation is not physical, not performative, not dramatic. It is relational, ethical, and moral. It is the continuous calibration of internal truth against social perception, of curiosity against responsibility, of visibility against relational trust. It is the patient, deliberate, iterative practice of inhabiting a self that is honest, accountable, and empathetic simultaneously. Walking through familiar streets now, I feel a quiet resonance. I notice glances, subtle reactions, rhythms of social movement, and I navigate them consciously. I inhabit myself with awareness, ethical consideration, and moral attentiveness. The weight of perception is present, yes, but it no longer intimidates. I have learned to balance visibility and discretion, curiosity and responsibility, expression and reflection. And yet, I am aware that transformation is never complete. Identity is iterative, relational, and ethical. Selfhood is an ongoing negotiation, a continuous practice. And in that understanding lies freedom, not the freedom of unbounded action, but the freedom of deliberate, reflective, and accountable living. I recognize now that the most profound aspect of this journey is neither internal alignment nor external expression alone. It is the cultivation of ethical presence, the ability to inhabit oneself fully while remaining conscious of consequence, relational impact, and moral responsibility. It is the practice of empathy, patience, and reflection, sustained over time, in ordinary moments, and in the subtle intersections of visibility and perception. Sitting on a park bench one evening, I watched the sunlight fade and consider the path I have traveled. Michael, the reliable, predictable, socially readable version, still exists, but now alongside him exists a Michael who inhabits curiosity, complexity, and ethical responsibility. Not fully resolved, not perfectly aligned, but alive, attentive, and accountable. And in that coexistence, I find peace. Not closure, not finality, but understanding. Understanding that transformation is lived in reflection, in relational integrity, and in ethical alignment. That selfhood is never singular, but multifaceted and iterative. That visibility carries weight, and honesty carries responsibility. And that inhabiting oneself fully, ethically, attentively, empathetically, is, ultimately, the truest form of freedom.